So welcome everybody to our December 17th, 2020 BDAC meeting, which is our final meeting of 2020. Unfortunately, we are still remote. I really hoped to be in person, but I'm glad to see many of you, if only on the screen. And I hope that you and your families are all healthy and staying safe during this difficult time. I started the last meeting by recognizing all the hard work our BDAC members and working group members have done, and I'd like to do that again. It can't be said often enough how you all have performed excellent work in the face of literally the most challenging circumstances. And I really greatly appreciate you for sharing your time, knowledge, and resources to help the BDAC. This work is very important and it is making a difference. And I thank all of you for your contribution. So I want to set down a few ground rules. You've heard these before. First, please keep your microphone muted unless you're speaking. It's nice to see you on camera, but it's fine if you don't want to be. Second, if you have a question or would like to make a comment, please raise your hand. There's a button for that electronically, and I will call on you. Otherwise, it'll be difficult to have an orderly discussion, and Justin will help me to make sure I don't miss anybody with a comment, but please just use that raise your hand button. Third, you'll be hearing about the proposed final report and recommendations from the low-income working group. If after discussion the BDAC decides to vote on that item, voting will be held through the chat room. So each member has a chat function on Teams. So I'll ask each of you to vote aye or nay in the chat and it will be counted accordingly. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Chris Monteith, Chief of the FCC's Wireline Competition Bureau, for remarks. Chief Monteith has overseen the Wireline Competition Bureau since its creation in 2017, and her support and the support of the attorneys in the Wireline Competition Bureau and elsewhere in the Commission have been vital to the BDAC's continued success. I'm very excited she can join us today. Chief Monteith.
Thank you so much, Chair Boyles, and I am excited to be here today. Like you, I so wish that we could be together in person at the Commission's new site, in our new Commission meeting room, which I understand is state of the art. But alas, here we are 9 months after beginning mandatory telework for the Commission, at least. We're still on mandatory telework. I also want to echo your words and just thank the members of the BDAC so much for all of your tremendous work over the past year. Little did I know when I thanked everyone who volunteered to serve on the BDAC that we would face our 9th month of mandatory telework and other measures that we've all had to take to combat the COVID-19 pandemic. But despite that, you all have proven that you can do it. You can do it remotely. And all of your work has helped to really bring home and highlight the importance of broadband and broadband deployment across the nation. You've gone above and beyond to produce fantastic reports and recommendations while you yourselves are juggling the many challenges of the pandemic, whether it be caring for those who may be at home or helping with your children's remote learning. We have all faced these tremendous challenges, but yet it has not stopped your important work. Over the past 18 months, you've tackled some really important issues, what to do in response to disasters and how industry should prepare, how we can improve recovery after a disaster. These are all questions that are too often asked after the disaster occurs. Documenting various strategies and solutions that stakeholders developed and implemented in real time to address the deployment-related challenges presented by the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as best practices that stakeholders are learning as we respond to COVID-19.
Julie Carney.
The challenges
is
of
now
access
joining.
To broadband, both in terms of adoption and deployment in low-income communities, as well as recommendations on how to bridge the digital divide, and how to support and develop a workforce with the knowledge and skills necessary to meet the unique demands of broadband deployment in a world where 5G and ubiquitous fiber and data will change our lives. The combination of your hard work, talented experts from industry, public interest, and government you have all stepped up to help answer these important questions and provided excellent reports that will help to shape the policy discussions for years to come. And the Commission could not be more appreciative of your hard work. I thank you, Chair Bowles and Chair Young, Vice Chair Young, for your leadership. And I want to recognize Letitia Latina, Rican Thacker, Red Grasso, Jonathan Adelstein, Tom Faree, and Claude Aiken for their efforts as chair and vice chair of their respective working groups. I also would be remiss if I did not recognize the Commission staff that's worked so hard to support the BDAC in your important mission. From my own bureau, the Wireline Competition Bureau, your dedicated, tremendous DFO, Justin Fall, and Zach Ross, Belinda Nixon, and Daryl Pay have been fantastic as deputy DFOs. Also on staff from WCB, Elizabeth Kuttner, Megan Danner, Mason Sheffa, and Gordon Reith have all helped support the effort, as well as Michael Conley from the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau. And I can't forget to thank Dan Kahn, the Associate Bureau Chief in the Wireline Competition Bureau's front office, who helps to oversee the work of the BDAC, and of course, Pam Arlock, who's the Chief of the Competition Policy Division, and her staff works so intimately with all of you. I know you know that there's a lot of work that goes into both being on and helping to support a federal advisory committee. You have day jobs that you have to pay attention to, obviously, and lots of other demands on your plate. And we so appreciate your willingness to devote many long hours to the work of the BDAC. Thank you for bringing your talent and your energy and your expertise to these significant issues and this important work. We truly appreciate it. And as I said, I think one of the things, and I always try to look for silver linings in any situation, but one of the things that the pandemic really has done is bring into very, very sharp focus the importance of broadband deployment. Without it, we are not doing mandatory telework for those of us at the Commission and many of you in your jobs. And we're not able to help our children with their remote learning. It just could not be more important. And I think that we do need to take stock and recognize that benefit, perhaps, from what we're experiencing right now. So I'll stop there. I really do want to, again, thank you for the opportunity of just addressing you for a few minutes. Thank you for all your hard work. I wish you a safe and wonderful holiday season, and please be well and take care. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief Monteith. Those are very kind words, and I want to echo what you said about the FCC staff, who has been literally amazing to work with. Thank you very much for making them available, and thanks to them for all of the time and effort, and I know on top of their day jobs, to make this a successful working group. I very much appreciate it. So with that, I'm going to turn the meeting over to Tom Faree and Claude Aiken for the presentation of the Increasing Broadband Investment in Low-Income Communities Working Group report and recommendations. Tom?
All right. Chairwoman, can you hear me?
Okay. I can.
I'm going to attempt to pull up our content here. I had a problem with this last time, so hopefully it hopefully we'll meet with more success today. Okay, do you see it yet? No? All right.
You're clicking on the slide tray?
I'm trying
little
to.
thing?
Yeah, the share content.
Mm-hmm.
PowerPoint. Justin, perhaps I could send it to you in the interest of time.
I have it. I can
Yeah,
try
send
to
it
share
away.
it.
Or do you have it,
Or we
Chairwoman?
can try to-
I think you sent it to me. I can try to share it too.
Okay.
Go ahead and send it to Justin in case, please, in case it doesn't work.
Okay.
Oh, I lied. Oh, no, I do have it. Yeah, I do. Sorry, didn't lie. All right, let's see if we make this work. Did you get it?
There we are. Okay.
Got it. Okay.
You beat me
Okay.
to it.
You got it? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, not to disappoint, I fumbled the handoff again, Chairwoman Bowles, but it's good to be with you and Vice Chair Young, and certainly the the balance of the full BDAC. It's a pleasure to be with you. I know I speak for Claude when I say we are happy to provide the excuse for all of us to get together here at the holidays. So hopefully we will do quick treatment to this. I think what we will present today from the last time we were gathered is we had a pretty quick turn, Chairwoman. We had approximately 2 weeks from the time that you gaveled down to the time when we needed to meet our 30-day lead time to Justin and the team. I want to commend not only our working group, but several members from the larger BDAC that joined us in that very quick turn. We had something no less than, I think, 11 meetings, both in small and large group, to make sure that we tightened down the pros and also provided, I think, at the end, a product that should help serve to advise policy going forward, and one that I think we're very proud of, and I think is a much better product because of the feedback that we received from the last BDAC. There was a lot of interest, and I thank them very much, the few individuals that joined our working team of merry men here as we worked over those last 2 weeks preceding or following the last BDAC. So I'm going to pause for a minute and recognize my trusty co-chair here, Claude Aiken, for a few opening comments as well.
Well, thank you, Tom. I'll keep it brief, and I won't go into, as we discussed earlier, a reading from Dickens or maybe leading us in some holiday songs. But I would just like to echo the thanks that Tom and our esteemed chair and vice chair have stated. We couldn't have done this without the wonderful work of the committee and the great feedback that we received from the broader BDAC. So in the interest of getting to the meat of the presentation, I'll stop there and yield back to Chair.
Thank you, Claude. All right, so let me take you through a few things. Again, we will try to do more abbreviated fashion to this because these are in the spirit of revisions. I don't think any of these are substantive overhauls. And so I think we could, and you all obviously have received the report in advance. So Chairman, with your approval, we'll move through in a more expedited fashion of our content today. The first thing I would do is just to encapsulate how we spent the approximate 14 days we had to incorporate all of the rich feedback that we received. We, from about the 29th, and I think we actually got together literally that afternoon following the meeting to make sure that we had ample time to incorporate, investigate, and further refine some of the feedback that we received. Again, I think we had no less than about 11 meetings, and that's not including the time that Scott, Jordan, Jeff, and Anthony and Jane Builder, all of us, I think we're in pretty agile communications throughout the time to make sure we hit our marks. I also want to give a special thank you. As I mentioned, there were several comments that we collected during the actual presentation itself, but particularly I want to call out a subgroup that took the time and interest not just throw feedback in an open forum, but actually roll up their sleeves and get in it with us to make this product a much better submission for you, Chairwoman. Especially, I want to recognize Jonathan Adelstein, Kelly Cole, Mr. Hansen, Eve Lewis, Chris, Nancy, and of course, our Vice Chair, David Young, who became very intimate with some of our revisions to help us get to that place. What you will see before you is one that now is even improved from the submission that we reviewed in October, which I'd say was heavily in the category of draft. What we submitted for your final consideration is one that is much more appropriate from a copy editing perspective and a final fit and finish. We also added, along with some of the revisions, we've added certain aids like a table of contents and things that are appropriate for a final report that time got away from us on their initial presentation in October, that those things came in a little late. So I think what we have before you, and hopefully for voting action today, Chairwoman, is a final product. That was submitted on November 16th in accordance with our 30-day lead time to Justin, and you all should be in receipt of that. Okay, just to orient you in heat map fashion, what I would tell you is there were several opportunities, again, because the initial product had not gone through copy edit to the degree that we had wished. So there were a number of, I would say, typographical corrections and revisions that didn't really rise to anything, I would think, substantive. What I have highlighted in red here, Chairwoman, are the areas of probably more of the revised or added construct from what had been previously submitted. In particularly in the deployment report, we took a little bit more time in balancing the discussion on the correlation between income and deployment. We wanted to really, I think, shape that particular piece in a way that informed policymakers and didn't serve to indict or otherwise color a particular bias or perspective. We wanted to bring balanced and objective reporting to that investigation. We also, similar to the adoption piece, we did have some recommendations that we sought to refine or make more coherent. And then particularly in the deployment subcommittee group, we did strike one section that had been previously included, and that was a special call out on the tax strategies associated with incentivizing deployment. Upon, I would say, very thorough discussions and subsequent reviews, we believed that the pieces that we had accounted for in that particular section were not quite sturdy enough to warrant its own independent section. That is not to say that the tax levers aren't important in considering incentivizing deployment. They are, but we believed that the references that were contained in some of the other recommendations were sufficient to point in that direction without dedicating its own independent section. So we felt that was a more productive use of that recommendation to have it peppered throughout. So that is an amendment you will see into the new report from previous submission. Under the adoption subcommittee report, we did, I have here the COVID adoption study. We did 3 case studies, as you'll note. The one that has come in since the October 29th report was the finalization and approval from the Chicago Connected case study. It's a very compelling and interesting one that we were very fortunate to be able to include, particularly as it's direct alignment with the importance of K-12 education, connection to education, and within the low-income community, and certainly saw fit to include that here. That has been formally approved by that program personnel. I want to especially thank Hal Wood for his opportunity to include his program with us, and that is now formally submitted for your consideration. And then as far as the adoption subcommittee recommendations, those remain unchanged. There have just been, again, a few efforts to make them a little bit more coherent, add a few clarifying comments, and I think a citation that we needed to, an errant citation that we needed to correct. So again, not as a substantive changing in the adoption report as in the deployment, where really we focused the bulk of our discussions from the 29th of October through 16 November. So let me go in a little bit deeper detail, Chairwoman. So what you have in the deployment, again, is just for orientation, we broke the deployment recommendations into two categories. One was a general deployment recommendation suite, and the second one being one that is germane just to low income. Now, that is not to be ignorant to the fact that we were charged with finding recommendations just for the low income communities, but we did believe that inclusive of a low income strategy would be the inclusion of what we know to be tried and true general deployment recommendations. And so we felt that it was necessary and appropriate to include them as well, because they will have collateral impact to, or I should say, demonstrative impact into helping low income communities. And then, and so you'll find 13 of those here. Again, those have largely been refined from the ones that had been previously submitted. We did strike, though, again, the one that was on the tax piece. Of note, we focused on 5.1.1, 5.1.3, which is the minimized regulatory barriers, and then, well, I'll get into those are the two that probably warranted the most discussion and revision. And those were attempts to remove, I think, language. Some of it was, I think, semantics, but we wanted to remove language that either served to distract or had somehow become associated or had a connotation that was unintended, and therefore took the conversation in a way that wasn't productive. So we worked to synthesize some of that language to make it more productive in treating these cases. And those are on the general. I should also say 5.1.12, which was the wireless infrastructure deployment incentives, was another area that we spent a little time. Now, on the specifics of that, I will tell you under the 5.1.3, the minimized regulatory barriers, what we did was we had struck some of the references to some cases that highlighted railroad crossing permitting. We didn't know how specific that was or how applicable that could be, and served to really just, I think, open up some discussions that took us off task. We didn't see that there was a huge value add in including some of that, so we struck that. As well, we didn't want to get into the business of relitigating some of the things from previous BDACs as far as the state model code. Some of those reports, obviously, by your charge, Chairwoman, those things were accepted. And so bringing them back into discussion really just kind of served, I think, as a distraction with, again, the presumption that those things, we want to be additive and not necessarily revisiting former actions, either in the pro or the con. So some of those references we voted from the committee perspective served to only distract the intention of what our scope is. So you'll find some cleanup in that regard. Also in 5.1.3, I should go back here, the minimized regulatory barriers. There was an Alaskan right-of-way example. I know I'm getting into the nit a little bit, but we struck that because as we examined that further, some of those examples were not necessarily at this point bona fide policy, but recommendations within that state government. So we have pulled that out as it not being sturdy enough, I think, for inclusion in a federal report at this time. We also have struck some what we didn't really hold to be extreme value add in some of the SEC small cell orders relevant to deployment recommendations. So again, I don't think that these are substantive in nature, but they serve to enhance. But if they didn't meet the threshold of enhancing but distracting, we decided it was better for the organization to take those out. Okay. 5.1.12, the wireless was the other. The notation there is, glad to include this one. This one came from Kimball. It's a great ad where we included in this section near the end of that recommendation, you will find a reference to the tribal priority window as it pertains to future spectrum auctions. There is some reference there to its success in a previous application of that feature, And so we wanted to put that forward as a way to incentivize deployment for future spectrum auctions on tribal lands. It was a great addition by Kimball. Thank you. Okay, Chairwoman, as we move then into the low-income specific ones, again, these outside of a few wordsmithing opportunities to add to coherency, the only one that we probably did more treatment to was 2.5.2.2. And what I will tell you that is the place where we actually, one of the subsequent recommendations in there was one that was more dedicated to a very tax specific strategy, expensing, capital gains, property tax abatements, things of that variety that we believed the spirit of the tax area for investigating incentives is more covered as part and parcel to some of the previous recommendations. And as we got into it, trying to defend it in its own call out was not sturdy enough from some of the citations and recommendations or examples that we could put forward. So we felt that, again, that served to really divide people versus inform a discussion. So we made the committee decision to let those recommendations come forward in the context of other previously submitted ones. Okay, let me pause there. We have the great opportunity here with Claude and Jeff here, both being leaders in that group. I think I've covered that, gentlemen, but if there is something that you wanted to enhance, certainly could yield the floor to you now.
This is Claude, nothing from my perspective.
Okay. All right, so then I will move on to the adoption. Again, this largely didn't change. We had, again, just what I would say is a few wordsmithing opportunities to add to the coherency. We also had the opportunity to tighten down some citations that our October 29th report was deficient in, so we certainly did that. They pulled that section of the report, Chairwoman, here. I believe the first one that I would direct your attention to is on page 36. And by the way, Nancy and Eve provided a lot of good feedback to us on this one. I want to thank them for their time and certainly their energy to join us in private session to work through these things to make it a better report. There was some coherency challenges that we had, and this on page 36 under the availability of a broadband connection. We just had some clumsy language in there that we helped tighten up, and also backstopped it by the sturdy reference to the broadband deployment report that really becomes the source for some of these percentages that had been cited. So you will find that. Moving on to page 45, which was really the only other, I would say, big area of revisiting. Pardon me. Comes in the area of improving data. We had a great discussion on this. I want to particularly recognize Larry Hansen. We had the good fortune of the Georgia mapping report, mapping release that happened in very close proximity to this discussion with Larry, Nancy, and Eve, and he shared with us some of the details and the success of that effort as it pointed directly to some of the data sharing recommendations that we have here. And so we set about trying to memorialize a lot of those lessons learned into some refined copy for this particular section. I think to be completely transparent, I think there was a pretty strong interest in including words like mandatory and some of those things. We needed to also balance that with inviting industry in to participate in these type of things, realizing there is a strong sense to require, but also to be sensitive to the aggregation levels and confidentiality concerns that are inherent in industry's participation in these things. So hopefully we struck that balance in a way that puts forward a strong recommendation on the value of not only improving data, but the accessibility and the sharing of that as well. And particularly when we talk about the adoption pieces, that's a little bit different than the availability requirements that have typically informed the required or mandatory criteria. So that is an area that we noted is a little bit of a difference in mapping availability versus adoption. And at this point, we feel like we have a pretty strong recommendation in that particular area, given the context. I also want to note that, it's interesting, just anecdotally, Chairwoman and Vice Chair Young, that, availability, particularly we're seeing, Data Act and other things that may finally see funding as part of the omnibus bill that is, I guess, moving its way through Capitol Hill as we speak. At least from our vantage point, we're seeing the affordability question certainly become something that a lot of states are trying to wrestle with. So I do want to just affirm that is right on the money as far as bringing that forward for discussion, because again, availability is one thing, getting into the affordability of it and thus the adoption is something that is going to be of increasing import as we go forward in learning from this COVID-19 pandemic. I would also, that's another great jumping off point, and something that I think, I can't remember if it was Nancy or Eve, was, particularly in the review of the case studies, how much of this stuff has been either started or somehow enhanced because of COVID relief funding, CARES Act or otherwise. And and what does that mean for the sustainability of some of these programs? It's a very legitimate question, and one that I think certainly I spent a lot of time, Jordan, Scott, and I, and Anthony really went deep there to see what could we find that could point to some likelihood of sustainability on this. And I think the jury's still out, Chairwoman. As this crisis begins to seed, will the experience that was brought into the home through some of these programs, either through corporate philanthropy or otherwise, will they have the staying power because of, maybe access to gainful employment at a time, or is the relevance issue, we obviously think because so much of our life moved online, relevancy is probably not so much an issue anymore, but you'll still wrestle with the economics of it. And so, I think the work of this committee necessarily has to stop before that verdict is finally rendered. And so we would encourage the commission and certainly all of us from our respective stakeholder groups to continue to keep an eye on that and see what happens as these, life begins to return to normal and some of these programs either begin to fall away or reduce in their potency. So we shall see. And also not just from the consumer perspective, but also, I think industry will learn a lot in this regard as to what is the relative return on investment. Does it serve to get people into a more enhanced consumption of the service? We shall see. Those are certainly things that I believe are still unanswered, and somewhat regrettable that our committee's work is ending at this point when really some of the harvest of these studies is yet to come. Okay, let me pause there and recognize our great leader, Scott Rudd, on the adoption piece and see if there are other items that he would like to color in.
Tom, I think you adequately covered all of those. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you, Scott. So, Chairwoman, that's what I have before you. Again, I'm happy to go deep into chapter and verse as we need. Again, I think having the benefit of this being reviewed just recently and also the nature of these revisions being not terribly substantive, hopefully it is a body of work that is still very familiar with the team.
Well, thank you very much. And I want to commend you all on the extremely rapid turnaround. 2 weeks is nothing to be sneezed at. And I also want to thank everybody who stepped up to help the working group make this possible. I think it's fine work. It's very thorough. And I would like to open the floor at this time for discussion. For any comments or questions, remember, please raise your hand in the chat and we will call on you. Questions, comments? Brent Scorup.
Yeah, thank you, Chairwoman Bowles. I just have a question on 2.5.1.12, there's
If I may pause once, David is going to pull up the document. If you just,
okay.
I mean, you go ahead and talk, but I just want to let everyone know
Yeah.
Dave's going to.
So it's a recommendation that the commission adopt a use it or lose it, or a use it or share it policy with to avoid spectrum hoarding by wireless carriers. There are a lot of reasons that spectrum goes unused, and to single
Section are you referring to? Let me pull it up here.
let's see, it's page 25.
Okay, got it. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
So the use it or share it, there's a lot of reasons that spectrum goes unused, and to single out wireless carriers when this, I mean, it's true of a lot of spectrum users, that spectrum goes unused, particularly in rural areas for a lot of reasons, and public safety bans and unlicensed bans, utility company bans. But this singles out wireless carriers, and if it seems like if it's good for the goose, it's good for the gander, and I don't think it's good for the goose or the gander to have your spectrum yanked if you're not using it. This would have an effect on spectrum auctions, certainly, if you have this possibility of your spectrum being yanked away, and the thing about mobile carriers, unlike many other users, they've paid for that, and the incentive would seem to be, you could just put up LTE broadcast and just start blasting out, not unneeded LTE. You would divert funds from needed areas, say, and build it up capacity in an urban area in order to, nominally use spectrum in an unneeded area. So I don't know. It seems unwise to me to single out wireless carriers for this policy, and I think it would have some perverse incentives.
So I'd actually like to dive into that a little bit, because I think you said maybe three things. The first off, which is singling out of wireless carriers, I tend to agree. I think it's spectrum holders, not wireless carriers. There are a lot of spectrum holders who might hold spectrum. There are investors who buy spectrum in spectrum auction with the intention of monetizing it later, who have no intention of using it at all. So I think this is not just a wireless carriers thing. So I personally take that point. I disagree with you on, I don't know if I disagree with you, but you're using the word needed. And the way you're framing that definition is where there is greater demand. But I would argue that, at least within the confines of this working group, it's desperately needed in rural areas where there's no cellular service at all. And if a mobile carrier can't justify bringing broadband to those rural areas, then somebody else could if they had access to the spectrum, which is my understanding of the use it or share it. The last sentence may be more of a trigger for you, which is the divesting unused spectrum. And again, if there's a good reason they're not using it, then they can present that. The spectrum holder could present that. So I personally don't have a problem with this provision. I would be completely open personally to changing it to refer to all spectrum holders and not just wireless carriers. But with that, I'll see if other people. We have, let's follow this track a little bit, and then we have a lot of people with their hands up too. So any other comments to this provision? Well, we can discuss it as we go. So I guess we'll go.
This is
Yes,
Karen
ma'am.
Charles. This is Karen Charles Peterson. Can I just follow up on on
Yes.
your comments, Chairwoman Bowles? So first, I'd like to say I agree with your comments, Madam Chair. And to ask Brent was, and I don't even know if this makes sense, but would it help to put like a time limit on how long the spectrum, unused spectrum, is being held? Brent?
Yeah, a time limit and would help, and I'd have to think about it, but yeah, time limit, and also I mean I just why single out wireless carriers when this is true in a lot of industries for a lot of spectrum users, yeah, I think there are some unintended consequences that come from this kind of forced, compelled sharing.
So Brent,
Chris
just to
Nurse
follow
had a
up on
comment.
what the
Oh,
chairwoman.
sorry, go ahead. Mhm.
I'll be very brief. Just to follow up on what the chairwoman said, she's absolutely correct. You know, we are here trying to figure out the best way to deploy broadband during these dire times. And if we allow anyone, it's not just the wireless industry, but anyone to just hold on to unused spectrum, you know, if we can sort of address that issue or get ahead of that issue, I think this is the time to do it. And that's what we're trying to do here, because we want to make sure that all available spectrum is made available for anyone who can deploy in areas where others can't. And I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you. Chris Nurse.
Elizabeth, is this your proposed edit? Basically replacing wireless carriers with spectrum holders, which I would agree with.
That was my proposed edit, and I think that it would probably call for a little bit of clarification on the divestiture. I think with a use it, personally, I think with a use it or share it, divestiture should not really be necessary, because when they decide to use it, then they would be able to move into the spectrum and use it. I don't know that, I don't know how appropriate divestiture is, but so that would be that was my second comment. But yes, that's my first change. Chris Nurse.
Sure. Thanks. Well, thanks. I appreciate Brent bringing it up, because I think it is a good point, and it is a fair point, Elizabeth, that you could have. Some people say you have had some people buy spectrum and not deploy it, and significantly. Now let's put, if you will, sort of the bad actor aside for a moment. You could buy spectrum that is then going to cost 3 times your capital budget to deploy. So you're not going to be able to deploy it all in year one. You're going to phase it in, and so you're going to deploy it where you have the highest, congestion first, and then roll that phase out. To Brent's point, spectrum holders generally have bought the spectrum, and they bought it under the terms and conditions of the auction when they bought it. So if the FCC wants to put, say, like a build-out requirement, which is kind of a common thing on spectrum, that should be an upfront deal. But it would certainly be unfair to attach adverse terms to spectrum holding afterwards. So if you bought it and you knew it had a build-out requirement, that might have a lower price than if you didn't have a build-out requirement. So it would be unjust to attach terms like that after the fact. But the other point is, like, if the one entity buys it and they have say a build out obligation under the FCC regime when they go to the auction and win it, I think as this is proposed, essentially some other guy gets a windfall without having to buy the spectrum and without it going back to the FCC and out being re-auctioned, and that would seem to be, if you're going to have build-out requirements, that it shouldn't just then go from being sort of licensed spectrum to sort of being unlicensed spectrum, and somebody gets it for free or gets kind of a windfall. It would seem that it ought to go back to the FCC for re-auction.
I think that's an interesting point, Chris, and my understanding, this is maybe because I've heard of use it or share proposals in the past that I didn't catch that. My understanding is that isn't free. My understanding is that the spectrum holder is compensated for the use of their spectrum, but that's a really good point. I'm going to give Tom Free a chance to respond, and then Michael Hain.
Thank you,
Tom.
Chair. Yes, can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Mine was more just on the wordsmithing. I just was going to submit if service providers was a better label than spectrum holders, just because we employ the word spectrum label. It's more of a style point, but I don't know.
My suggestion of spectrum holders, and this is not to trigger any drama, but the federal government holds a lot of spectrum that they don't use.
Sure.
There are spectrum holders who are not providers.
Good point. No, that's very accurate. Agreed.
Elizabeth, could I recommend that maybe adopt should be maybe investigate? Part of it would be like, how long is a reasonable period? To use spectrum, and sort of how much of your spectrum do you have to, if you're using 99% of it or 90%, or, how much do you have to build? How fast do you have to build? How does that sort of work? what's the process if you have it in your capital plan to do it next year, that kind of thing. I mean, I think it's an issue. There are, I think, abusive cases, but I think there's a lot of ordinary business as usual cases of people get the spectrum and use it over time. And I think distinguishing the one from the other would be worthwhile.
Is there a way to word that? Because I assume that like that level of granularity is the FCC's job. So is there a way to word in here that what we're basically saying is that the FCC needs to make those determinations in creating this policy? Because I think you're right.
I think there's two things. One is I think this presupposes that if you found hoarding to be the case, that sharing is the issue. And shared spectrum is kind of a loaded term. That's a different kind of issue where I think essentially if you have like a build out obligation, you don't meet the build out obligation, the spectrum should return to the FCC and then they should re-auction it. To me, share it kind of means it gets to be like Wi-Fi spectrum or something like that. So it has a kind of connotation that it turns into a windfall. The best case is for you to sit back, let somebody else buy it, not use it, and then have it become shared free spectrum, which I don't think is necessarily the case. And then share. How do you do the sharing geographically? That it gets that can be very complicated. So I think that maybe the commission should investigate use it policies and then develop effective remedies to preclude the possibility of spectrum hoarding, because I think that's what we're targeting, without necessarily prescribing, use it or share it as the solution.
Chris, are we saying divest here does not mean give away for free, right? It just means.
I don't know. I don't know what divest means. It sounds kind of like confiscate.
It sounds like that sounds like what he was saying about giving it back to the FCC, divest, like having to give it back.
Yeah, I mean returning to the FCC, it would be better language.
Let's let Michael add his comments and then we'll wordsmith a little bit.
Yeah, everybody's got some really good ideas about this and how to make it more usable. Again, the bottom line is that we don't want to let this valuable resource be unused. On the other hand, those that have already paid for it, Chris, your point's very well taken. You can't really go retroactive on it. What we've done with the CBRS auction, establishing the priority access licenses, seems like a good method. Not that we would need necessarily an SAS on each transmitter, but if the FCC could use a model similar to that to allow the spectrum to be utilized until such time that the license holder was ready to use it, that may be a good way to use the resource. Anyway, that doesn't help with the wordsmithing, but that's just a thought.
So thank you, Michael. I don't want to make too much of a sausage of this, but let me propose this. If you take the second sentence, spectrum holders should not be permitted to hold spectrum without using it to serve customers throughout their licensed areas. If that becomes the first sentence and you add the word unreasonably, spectrum holders should not be permitted to hold spectrum unreasonably without using it to serve customers throughout their licensed area, or something like that, and make it the first sentence of the paragraph. Then the second sentence becomes, therefore, the commission should investigate, use it or share it, and other policies to reduce the possibilities of spectrum hoarding.
Mm-hmm.
So change adopt to investigate. Yeah.
Yeah, I like that, Chairwoman.
This is Doug. I agree. That sounds great. The other thing I'd do is at the very end, in the third sentence, where it says to allow other carriers, just say to allow its use, since we took out the reference to carriers.
Right. And then, David, I think in the top line, Elizabeth said use it or share it or other policies.
Correct. And then that becomes the second sentence. And then I guess the they would have to be if the spectrum holder is, because otherwise it's an indefinite reference. if they are unwilling, if the spectrum holder is.
And I think you need an it after return, David.
Where do you see that?
In the sentence below, 2 sentences below, return to the FCC. I think it's return. Okay. Okay. No, I'm going to take it back. Return to the FCC on unused spectrum. Yeah, that's fine.
And the last word, it, can be deleted.
Okay.
Doug, Chris, are we sausage making?
No, I think it's good.
Looks like very
I
tasty
appreciate
sausage.
Yeah.
And now,
Tasty
move on.
something. Yeah.
Doug, I think you had your hand up from before, so I'm going to call on you.
I did. Thank you very much. So mine, I wanted to go back to something, Tom, you had mentioned earlier in your remarks about, the fact that the information that you've been gathering, by the way, terrific job to you, Claude, and the rest of the group that worked on this. I think this is really, really incredible. But on the timing issue, and what I mean is if you look at section 3.2 on adoption, one of the things that struck me is some of the foundational references that you're looking at and used to inform the report include the Pew Foundation study. And what struck me is that it was done, I guess, in early 2019. What will be really interesting is how that may change, that results of that study might change as a result of where we are now in the pandemic. So it's just a comment that it'll be interesting to see if those percentages change and among the categories of ages, et cetera, will change. And I'm wondering if anybody has any information about whether there's an update to that study underway. So yeah, again, it's in 3.2. I don't know if you want to bring it up, but the charts are in particular really interesting when you look at there you go, that one and the following one.
So,
in the next.
Sorry, Doug.
Yeah.
I was going to give Tom an opportunity to respond because there sounded
Yeah.
like there was a question there.
Yeah. One, I'm not certain as to what Pew's plan is to update that on what timeline. I will note that Scott and Jordan both were very, and we tried to make this something of a very constant refrain throughout the report. Section 3.3 opens with the acknowledgement that with COVID-19, kind of almost all bets are off. I'm paraphrasing, but the study is still, as I mentioned in my comments, the jury is still out. That we continue. I think it's that last sentence there or next to the last sentence. The experiment in this lab has playing out in real time, and we continue to learn. So I think you're absolutely right. Perhaps we could amplify that a bit more. That basically tells the reader everything you've read is out for further investigation post COVID. So, but I agree. I don't know. I have to say though, it's probably a fertile field of study. Pew and I'm sure others will be really getting deep into this. I just don't know necessarily. Perhaps we could add something there that suggests, the lookout for subsequent reports. I don't know if anybody has a comment on that, or even if they have, Chairwoman, an update on where Pew is, or Brookings, or any of these other folks.
Yeah, I hope they do update it. I think they do regularly. I don't know if it's annual, but I agree. That'd be very interesting to see where that data ends up post-COVID.
No, it almost deserves its own specific, something off the normal cycle to really go deep in that area.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, and mine was
please,
just a comment. I'm not recommending that we necessarily change, Tom, the language. You've highlighted this. I just point out and was curious as to whether anybody knew about the status of an update to that info.
So, yeah, if we hear anything, let's keep the group informed, because I think it's a really good point. If anybody hears Pew's, what Pew is planning to do, it would be good to know. With that, I'm going to call on Nancy Werner.
Okay, thank you, Chairwoman Bowles. I hate to go back to the spectrum thing just real quickly though. Sorry, I didn't get my hand up quite in time. And this isn't, I have something else I actually wanted to talk about, but the way I'm reading that sentence as revised, I'm afraid it kind of implies that all spectrum should be used to serve customers. And there is spectrum that is, reasonably, lawfully, appropriately used to do things other than serve customers. I don't think it's a huge deal, but it just kind of reads like all spectrum should be for serving customers or it should be repurposed. I don't think that's what we intend to say. So if others think I'm reading into it too much, that's fine. I'll move on to my main question.
Well, is it the service? I mean, I don't know, because it did occur to me that throughout their service areas, but the service areas is a legacy of how it was written before. But I'm wondering, can that also mean, if it's first responders, their service area is the area that they need to cover for their first responder network? Or is that, I mean, I don't know how the
yeah. Or is the word customer, I guess, how are we using that term? If you're using it for public safety purposes, is that serving a customer? Maybe we could, I guess I'm thinking of customer as like the end user, resident, or, business, and not necessarily some of the other ways that spectrum is used. But again, I don't want to go in the rabbit hole. I think it's probably fine, but it just occurred to me that there are some uses that I wouldn't think of as serving customers, but that doesn't mean that the spectrum is being misused. So I'll just throw that out there. If no one else has an issue with
Charles
it.
Peterson again.
Yeah.
I think if we're talking about public safety, in my mind, customers is appropriate. But are there other examples that you can provide, Nancy, where customers outside of public safety? Because I think with public safety, it's fine, the term customers.
Well, I think that was my primary concern. There are, other uses of spectrum as well. And I guess you could always
because
find
at the end of the day, customers.
Well, the customer can be the school district that owns the 2.5. The customer could be the first responder. The customer could be a residential customer. The customer could be a governmental agency. I mean, I think it.
Yeah. Okay.
First, I think
intended users, would intended users apply? I'm thinking some of the government spectrum use might be different, might not have a customer per se.
Doug, that's kind of what I had in mind, but again, I don't want to make a huge deal of it. I don't think it's a big
difference. I don't think it's a big difference because the FCC determines what spectrum is being used for what purpose.
Mm-hmm.
So intended users would be appropriate, and it does need an S on the end of the word users.
Okay. Thank you.
You had another comment though, I think, before
I did. And first, I should say thank you so much to Tom and everybody on the working group. I really appreciate the time and effort they put into the report and specifically spending some time addressing some of the concerns that we raised at the last meeting. So I do have a few comments and maybe some proposed revisions in section 2.5.1.3, page 22.
Thank you, Nancy.
So in the first footnote, bullet point, the reference to the National League of Cities guidelines. First, just the reference in the footnote, the citation looks like it's incorrect, which is, I think it's cited earlier in the report, so that can be easily changed. But my larger point there is that document, NATOA co-authored that with NLC, and it is specific to permitting during COVID. And it's drafted here to sound like it's a more generic, here's how you should do permitting at the local level, which it is not. And I have not spoken to NLC about this, but as a co-author, I don't want that document represented as in a larger context than it was intended for. So I would propose either adding at the very end of that sentence after the word permitting during the COVID-19 pandemic, or possibly just deleting it, because when you narrow it down to being a pandemic related resource, it's less useful as a recommendation, but I'm fine either way.
I think that's a good add.
Yeah, okay. Chairwoman, I'd move to add the context to the COVID.
Yeah, I think that's fine.
Okay, thank you. And then,
Definitely.
Are we
thank you.
capitalizing it like this? Or is it this in the document?
Yeah.
What is the usage?
The
Like-
COVID-19 pandemic, is that how you're referring to it?
I think we did mixed case though. I don't think we did all caps. Let me make
Okay.
sure.
Thank you.
Okay,
That,
well,
that was something the copy editor really grabbed on with us on this. So I'm trying to find another example. I think it's lowercase though, or mixed case.
thanks. And I have a couple more things. I'll try to move quickly. So in the same section, the next bullet point identifies state and local statutes. I just want to say thank you. I really appreciate how that's reworded to talk about, stakeholders working together. My concern is with the sub bullet point, for example. Talking about unreasonable fees and lease payments, I'm not sure what fees and lease payments this refers to specifically. We don't talk about what unreasonable means. I feel like it loses that spirit of, if you have an issue with how a state or local law works, let's try to work it out. So I would propose deleting this sub bullet point.
But I mean,
I-
isn't that, I mean, that's defined in the term, right? I mean, reasonableness is a standard term used, for many things. I mean, it's case, it's case specific to what it is. But, and I don't think we have to define a reasonable term as, a number of X, or, X plus one or whatnot. But I think it just says that there is a point at which a fee or a lease payment becomes unreasonable, and that becomes an issue. And I think that that's neutral. I mean, that's not saying it should be free. It's not saying it should be $1 million. And I think that's straight down the middle.
I apologize, Chair, go ahead.
No, you're okay. I just wanted to add to that we've talked about reasonable and unreasonable fees in prior work of the BDAC.
Mhm.
And I think that that unreasonableness is something that reasonable people can determine, and it's the best we can do, because I don't think it's the job or appropriate for that working group to define, as Chris said, $100 is reasonable, but $1,000 is not, because we don't know what's reasonable in a particular context. But there are people who can determine reasonableness. And I think calling out unreasonable fees gives us a way of understanding what we're talking about in this context.
Yeah, I would.
May I ask again, though, which fees are we talking about? Are we talking about right-of-way fees? Are we talking about leases? Are we talking about pole attachment fees? Are we talking about leasing
All of the
municipal
above.
water towers? I mean,
All of it.
This is Doug. I think it's I'm thinking back to the model code for municipalities, and I do think it's important to keep this, because unless we all would have a consensus agreement that there are no circumstances of unreasonable fees, whatever generic reference that means. So I think it does make sense to keep it in, and it's consistent with what we've done before. On that point, Nancy, I think maybe if it just said imposing unreasonable fees or other payments might make it a little clearer that we're talking about many different kinds of payments. So it's a good question. What are we talking about? I think the answer from my perspective is it could be many different things.
But if we're making, apologize for the interruption, but if we're making the statement that fees deter or discourage further investment, if we're not, I mean, I guess I'm just not supporting a statement that says any kind of fee out there discourages deployment or investment. I mean, on
Nancy,
some level,
that's not a fair.
does that.
That's not a fair representation. It says unreasonable fees. It doesn't say that any fee out there, that a $1 fee is an impairment to deployment. It says unreasonable fees. Now, what is an unreasonable fee? I mean, if you were to delete it, that would allow the case that somebody could have a $25,000 fee or $1 million fee per small cell, and we would be taking the position, oh, that's, even $100 million fee is not a barrier. That's not true.
But
So
Chris,
what
that's
is
not
true?
the position we're taking.
What is true is that at some point the fee becomes so high that it becomes unreasonable. We don't need to determine today what the dollar level is for that, but we cannot. We just can't take the proposition. It's just not reasonable that fees, fees have no impact, and that any fee is fine, and any fee has no impairment of broadband, because clearly it does.
But Chris, that's not what I'm suggesting we say. I'm saying we can just delete that bullet point. We still
That's
have
worse. That's worse.
We still have the statement that says that statutes and ordinances that impede broadband deployment, stakeholders should work together to address that issue. We still make the larger point without having an ambiguous statement about unreasonable fees.
Well, I mean, perhaps it should be its own point instead of a sub-point. The statutes and the ordinance go to issues like, you know, what's the interval, what's the procedure, you know, do you have to have a PE stamp? Does he have to be licensed? You know, how many copies do you have to provide? That's the, you know, is there a winter moratorium? You know, that sort of thing. Those go more sort of the terms and conditions. That one goes specifically, even if you had perfect process and an inordinately high fee, the high fee alone could be the barrier to deployment. And I agree, you know, whatever the magic number is that is the point of reasonableness, you know, can be determined at the particular case and time. But I just can't agree that any level of fee has, no matter how high, has no impact on broadband deployment. That's just untenable.
Chris, I understand, and I'm not suggesting that that's what the reports say. I'm suggesting that the larger bullet point talking about cost-effective deployment is broad enough to include the fee issue without adding this language that kind of feeds the narrative that one of the big issues that needs to be addressed is local rights of way fees. I can't support that in the report.
No,
so I'm hoping that we could.
That doesn't say that if the right of way fee was a reasonable fee, it's not a barrier to deployment.
I understand that, but the debate is what is a reasonable fee.
Right, and
I have a couple more things.
And we all agree that an unreasonable fee is bad and a reasonable fee is good.
Before you move on, Nancy, I want to rephrase this, and I think. And I don't know if these people still wanted to comment, but Larry had his hand up briefly, and so did Brian O'Hara. Want to make sure that everybody's heard on the issue. Nancy's recommendation is to delete the language. I don't personally agree with that. I don't think Chris does, but I want to give anybody else an opportunity to speak. And I think we have a comment in it. Yes, sir.
This is Brian. I just wanted to say briefly. So I understand that example. However, you know, if I were going to put examples of what I see or my members see as impediments, state and local impediments, that would not be it. So I would have a whole nother laundry list of things. So I do understand where people are coming. I don't think if you took out that sub bullet that, for example, it would say that, and you know, it would hurt to say that, what I'm trying to say here, that removing it, I don't think says, oh yeah, sure, you can charge $1 million for this fee, and that's okay. I don't think that's going to happen in any way, shape, or form. You know, I do think that you get to your point without that sub bullet. And once again, I think if you get that example, then you get down the rabbit hole of what are the other examples that are out there. Just because we point out that, it seems like that's the only kind of example or problem that we are focusing on when there are a lot of other barriers out there. That is my concern on that one.
Can I also, thank you, Brian. Let me highlight something. For some reason, I'm not seeing the chats, so I apologize, but I tried to look for them and I can't, but Brent posted this at noon. Quote, reasonable fees come from federal law 47 USC 253. State and local governments can, quote, require fair and reasonable compensation from telecommunications providers on a competitively neutral and non-discriminatory basis, end quote. So we already know what is a reasonable fee, and we're saying imposing unreasonable fees, that is fees that don't fit that definition, would be an example of a barrier to broadband deployment. So I have Larry and Ken, and I think Eve, and I don't know, Tom, did you want to say something about this? So let's start with Larry and then Ken.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. I actually agree with what Brian said, that it's sort of like we're cherry picking, taking one perceived obstacle, but I mean, we could sit here all day and come up with obstacles to deployment. I mean, I could sit here and say one impediment to furthering broadband is large corporations that spend hundreds of $millions on naming stadiums and arenas, or $20 million CEO salaries are an impediment to deployment of broadband. So it just seems like we're sort of picking one out of many. But to me, if we want to try and fix it and leave it in there, it's written in the negative sense. It could be just written in the positive sense. It could say that reasonable fees encourage, broadband deployment and investment. I mean, why does it have to be written in a negative way as if it's accusatory?
Could you say reasonable fees as opposed to fees that would be unreasonable, encourage? I mean, I don't know that matters. I'm just asking.
Reasonable fees encourage investment and deployment.
Okay. Well, that's a suggestion. Let's hold that and let Ken make his comment.
Sure. Thank you, Chairwoman. I just wanted to express my support for leaving that sub-bullet in there. There were a number of changes that were made throughout this section 2.5.1 in this revised report that eliminated references to other work that had been done by the previous BDAC with respect to trying to effectuate some of the acceleration of deployment of broadband that I thought was very helpful in the original report and had been deleted, which caused me some concern. One of the key things is this exact point about the imposition of unreasonable fees, which, to Brent's comment, would potentially be a violation of Section 253. One of the things that convinced me to be supportive of this report was the inclusion of this sub-bullet, because it is one of the most critical challenges with respect to broadband deployment. And I think it is entirely appropriate for it to be here and is consistent with what federal law already provides and is consistent with what the findings of the prior BDAC were. So I don't think there should be any concern about including it. And I think the report makes very clear that this is just a listing of certain examples of things. There is nowhere in the report that suggests this is intended to be an all-inclusive list of everything that can be done. So I would be very supportive of leaving the language. I like the change that was suggested to delete the word lease. So I think that is a good change, but otherwise I would be supportive of leaving it in its current form.
So I'm going to call on, I think it's Scott. Rudd, did you have a comment?
I did just put an item in the chat that, it does appear to me that you could scratch that bullet and just add fees above as kind of one of the items in addition to local statutes, ordinances that could impede, deployment. Just a suggestion.
Local fees, statutes or ordinance, or local statutes, ordinances, or fees. Okay, Eve, did you have a comment?
Actually, thank you for calling on me, but I actually wanted to just echo the prior comments of Nancy, Brian, and Larry. And so basically there are multiple barriers we all have identified and we can all agree on that. And it does seem like honing in on one seems a bit inappropriate. And I did also like the idea of just flipping it to the positive and saying, let's focus on reasonable fees. So in the effort of not repeating all of those things, I did just want to talk about what Chris had mentioned as it relates to $1. So yes, we can all agree that $1 would not be an imposition of an unreasonable fee. However, if you look at just the phraseology of that bullet point, if it increases broadband costs for deployment, it does, $1 will, and then it discourages further investment. I mean, that's subjective. Perhaps that $1 does discourage further investment. So once again, I think what Nancy was honing in on is it's subjective to a degree, and phrasing it in this way doesn't necessarily, get us to the mark. So to support what Scott was proposing, I definitely think just adding that extra word fees, perhaps to the main bullet, accomplishes what everyone's needing to accomplish in this subsection.
I'm going to ask Chris Nurse and Tom Ferree and Claude and the members of that committee whether they agree that that would accomplish what the committee was trying to accomplish by adding fees up above.
Is this the edit that, Scott, you would be proposing, local statutes, ordinances, or fees?
Yes.
And I very much take to heart Ken's comment about watering down the previous work of the BDAC, which was hard discussed, and the better part of 2 years to get where we were previously. But for me personally, I think putting fees above may solve the problem. I'm going to invite Chris and Tom.
Chris, do you want to go first? Or you mean Claude, I think, right, Chairwoman?
I did mean Claude. I apologize, Claude.
Okay. Claude?
Look, I think that solution would work for me. I don't necessarily want to, state what it would work for anybody else, but I think we're making positive movement here. I would be okay with that.
Okay. Chris, nurse, your hand is up. I don't know if you actually wanted, or if that was from previous.
Yeah, I mean, it waters it down, but it's true. I can hold my nose and go with that.
Okay. Karen Charles Peterson posted in the chat that she also supports that. Nancy Warner.
Yes, thank you. I mean, I can support it. I would have preferred, I was trying to jump in and suggest we use the word costs instead of fees, which includes costs. But if fees is the resolution that everyone can accept, then I appreciate it, and I'll accept it as well.
Great. Did you have another comment though? You said
I do.
Yes. Wait, someone called my name.
I've got this up on my screen, so I can't use the chat function either, Elizabeth.
Oh, problem.
Okay, thanks. Can we take a vote on this item?
Yes,
about these two edits
we can.
before we move on? So I would second Scott Rudd's proposal for the language here and striking the edit here.
Okay, I'm going to put something in the chat. Hopefully people can see, which is motion to accept Scott Rudd change to, okay. 2.5.1.3. Okay, that's the motion. Do we have a second for that motion?
I think Scott Rudd made the motion and I'm seconding it.
Oh, Scott Rudd made the motion, you're seconding it. Okay, seconded. All right, now everybody, I'm going to call this for a vote. All in favor of this change to this report, please identify in the chat. And Justin, are you seeing my chats? I just put 3 in there. Because for some reason I'm only seeing my own and no one else's.
Yeah, sorry, for some reason I couldn't unmute. I am seeing everybody's chats.
Okay, great. Okay. You're gonna have to tell me how the vote goes, I guess, by text, because I can't see them. Not sure what's going on with my Teams.
Yeah.
You're
good. You're good. It's overwhelming, so we're good. We're good to move on.
Okay. All right, let's move. See,
So
did you have something else?
Just to clean some of this stuff up, I'm going to accept.
Jeff or David, Chairwoman, I had a question.
Yes, sir.
I think it was a holdover from the Nancy's first comment. So certainly, if you want to retire the fees question, mine was going back to the first bullet point where we added the context of during the COVID-19 pandemic. Mm-hmm. The only thing I would add there is I think, Doug brought it up earlier, and I think it's a good point, and this is an opportunity to present this, is that, there are things that we will learn, even though that document is inside the confines of a COVID-19 circumstance. I think there are things that could be learned from that are implementable, if that's a word, post COVID-19. So I think it's important not to just relegate this to emergency response, but we can learn from this. So I don't know if there's a way to, I'd hate for the lessons and learnings from that document to be only applied inside COVID-19, but could have application post-19 as well. I think there's an opportunity to talk about how this.
How about you add the words which may serve as guidance for future.
Yes.
Something like that.
Madam Chair, if I may, I actually would prefer not to have that language. I'm sorry. I just.
But we need it
not
because
write this to imply that a national organization can write the permitting standards for every community in the country. And so I appreciate what the point, and I don't disagree with it, but I feel like that might imply that NLC or NATOA wrote permitting standards that would work across the country, which is absolutely not what we would do. So I would much prefer that we just leave it as what it is.
I have to respectfully disagree because we're not saying that the National League of Cities should be prescribing what local communities can and can't do any more than we are saying that the BDAC is prescribing what local communities can and cannot do. What we're saying is this is a document that the National League of Cities came up with that issued guidelines in the terms of this pandemic that can serve as guidance for the future that we need to look at as we consider what municipalities and other stakeholders should do generally. There may be learnings out of it. So I don't think saying which should be considered for future policy decisions or something along those lines is going to somehow imply that therefore the National League of Cities is trumping local control, because clearly it's not.
Okay, I appreciate that.
Besides which, that goes the other way.
Maybe Jonathan Adelstein can join in, because he kind of initiated those discussions that led to that document, and it was all clear among all the stakeholders in that group that our main thing was this issue came up in the BDAC, but it was not a BDAC work product. We were very clear from the local government perspective that we did not want that work product to go to the FCC as a recommendation that could be turned into sort of a nationwide standard. So, I feel like, that was the spirit in which that document was created. And I think we're inadvertently getting to the point that we were trying to avoid in those discussions by making sure this was not a BDAC related standard.
What if we prefaced it with, for example? There it is again. But I mean, it just gives some fodder for, I don't know. Jonathan.
So I have a couple of thoughts about that, but I think Larry had his hand up.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I was just going to say, I think we need the permission of the authors of the document, which we don't have, to use it in a way that they did not intend. The document is specifically, clearly intended to be guidance for the COVID-19 pandemic. And so to now use it in a different way without the permission of the authors, which Nancy's already said, there's no permission from her organization, there's no permission from NLC, I think is inappropriate. I support the amendment as written, adding during the COVID-19 pandemic, but that's it.
So do we need to go get permission for every citation we've used here?
I think there's a fix. I think there's an easy fix, which and I respect that they want to leave it like it is. So I would say just put in another bullet, which goes to the point, and it is a truism whether we write it or not. A lot of lessons learned, and things done in the COVID-19 experience are going to have applicability afterwards. I mean, I can tell you just from my company's experience, we were pressed over our strong objection about having limited curbside pickup. We're a little guy in a kiosk, right? And then it turned out to be wildly popular. And so now it's something that we're going to continue to do, because it's something that once we did it, found out consumers really like it, we're going to do it. It's actually going to let us have a smaller retail store footprint, and it really orients us more to what customers want. So the world is just not going to go back to pre-COVID-19. And people who got remote access or got VPNs, they're not going to tear those down. They're not going to give back their little random number generators. A lot of the changes that were adopted are going to be permanent across society. So I think we could just sort of have something about a lot of the changes made, lessons learned during the pandemic will have applicability going forward, something neutral like that, and I think that embraces it without crimping NATOA or NLC's pride of authorship.
So that would be a bullet point that would go right after this.
Yeah.
4 identifies state and local statutes, and it would say many of the lessons learned during the COVID-19 pandemic have applicability post-pandemic and should be considered.
Yeah.
Okay. Did someone else have?
Maybe just to respond to Nancy.
Mari's been waiting a long time, but we're still in conversation. I think I just want you to know I haven't forgotten you. Nancy, did you have something else? Or was that all you had?
Before we do that, many lessons learned during the COVID-19 pandemic may
Oh,
have.
I'm sorry, Dave. Applications post-pandemic and should be considered moving forward. I don't know.
Sure.
Yeah, and I agree that makes the point without being too pointy.
Right. Nancy, does that get you out of the bind?
Yes, I appreciate that. Jonathan Adelstein, I think you were going to try to butt in. Otherwise, Chair Bowles, I didn't mean butt in. I didn't mean that in the rude way it came out. I apologize. And then Chair Bowles, I have a few other things, and I'll just run through them quickly after Jonathan speaks so that so I won't monopolize more time.
No, I was just going to say, Nancy, that what she said was accurate characterization of how we handled it. It was discreet. It was for that purpose, and so we want to make sure it's accurately characterized. That you're comfortable with it. We don't want to take something beyond where you'd be comfortable with it, given that it was done by consensus.
I appreciate that. Okay. And then again, I thank you everyone for indulging me for so long. I apologize. I didn't think this would generate that much discussion. So the last 3 things really quick. The next bullet, lease terms should be uniform and sufficient to encourage investment. Here again, I just wasn't sure what lease terms we're talking about. I assume we're talking about the rights of way, but I also am not sure what uniform means, like if we mean nationwide or across a state or across industries. So I was thinking we could just say lease terms for public rights of way offered to similarly situated providers should be uniform to encourage investment, just to be a little bit more focused on what we're talking about.
So Nancy, can I ask you, have you read the Model Municipal Code recommendations of the BDAC?
Yes.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure that you'd read that, because uniform and sufficient to encourage investment, that is a reference back to what was negotiated in the Model Municipal Code, which was passed unanimously. And it has to do with needing to make it more consistent pretty much across the basis with respect to local control, but nonetheless having it not a mystery every single community you go into. So I don't know how to, and I also don't think lease terms is actually only referring to the right of way either here, but the committee would have to answer that.
Okay, let me just real quick run through my last 2 things, then we can discuss whatever other people want to discuss about that. The other question or concern about this section is the legislative proposals. I know there's some concern about the reach of some of those bills that are listed there, and I was going to suggest we just delete those because there's a lot of them there. And then the final concern I had was in section 2.5.1.12. You don't have to go there, David. Just to remove the footnote and facilitate tower siting, there's still a footnote to the small cell bill. And I think Tom mentioned in his presentation that they had intended to remove those. And I would be supportive of the phrase facilitate tower siting if we can get rid of the footnote to.
Where is that at?
I think it's on page. I apologize, I don't have the page in front of me.
What's the section number?
2.5.1.12, page 25. So sorry, those are 3 just quick things. If people want to discuss them, that would be great. But I just wanted to let you guys know there's a light at the end of the tunnel of what I wanted to raise.
Alan Bell, did you raise your hand for these or for a different reason?
Yes, for these, I agree with the legislative point. For example, the first one I looked up and it said there wasn't even a summary available for the bill. So I'm fine to put ideas in there if there are ideas, but to just have a blank, somebody introduced a digital divide bill and they describe it in their press release, but you can't even find what's in the bill. I don't think that's a very good reference, and maybe it's just operator error and I couldn't find it, but when I clicked on it, that's what it led me to. It said there was no summary for this bill.
Oh, I've seen that language. I mean, I didn't know this was in here, but I have seen that language somewhere. Maybe it's not
You've seen
public.
the name of it or the whole bill?
I've seen the language of the bill.
Okay.
But it may have been through my congressman, and it may not be publicly available, in which case I agree it should not be in there unless it can be publicly accessed.
And these are all just proposals. I mean, if it's something that's at least passed one house or something is one thing, but I mean, just to reference any proposal that's out there.
Well, I think they're just saying they're legislative proposals that might have interesting ideas that we should look at. I don't have an issue with the way this is worded. These are basically proposals that can offer additional information that we should consider. I mean, it really doesn't say we should adopt them even. It just says, hey, look at these things, and this is what people are talking about.
I realize that, but that's the way, you know, it just struck me rather odd that the BDAC has been meeting for 2 years or however long on broadband deployment, and, you know, we go out and we find whatever proposal has been mentioned that could regurgitate stuff that BDAC has already addressed. So that's all.
It's true. Okay, well, I think Brian O'Hara had his hand up, but also I think, Tom, did you want to address any of these points? Brian and then Tom, or Tom and then Brian?
I just didn't lower my hand. I'm happy to offer comment after you've collected everybody's.
Okay. Brian?
Sure. Thank you, Madam Chair. So I was just going to touch upon, I think one thing that Nancy brought up, the lease term should be uniform and sufficient to encourage investment. So yeah, once again, what's the lease? What's that referring to, right? I know that let me just give you an example of pole attachments. I know many of my members have offered reduced or free pole attachments to get people out there. If you have something uniform, then that could stifle innovation for some innovative practices for folks to do something different. So that's just an example. Like I said, that goes to what you mean by lease. So I just bring that up, and I don't know if any municipalities or localities are providing certain discounts to try and get broadband out there. It could be happening. So I just raise that as a concern, and happy to hear the discussion.
So in my mind, this is a normative statement. They should be reasonable and they should be uniform. There's not actually a recommendation that says that they must be. And I think that, I mean, I personally would be hard pressed to disagree that the more uniform things are and the more reasonable they are, the more likely it's going to improve broadband deployment. I mean, and we can bicker over what those things are, but, oh, it's the previous section about the lease payments being uniform. It's right under the other, it's
It was a 2.5.1.3.
That's it. Thank you. I couldn't get back there.
There
My brain couldn't.
I apologize. Thank you.
So yeah, so I'm not sure if there's.
It's just a normative statement, and it's saying that we need to be cognizant of these things. And I think that the fact that your members are reducing what they charge, and the fact that some municipalities are working on their fees, indicates that people generally agree that these terms should be sufficient to encourage investment. And I do think that that's a free market issue, but from a normative statement, I agree with it.
Well, what I'm kind of concerned about, once again, is so like example, a lot of my guys, when they're reducing rates, they may reduce a pole attachment rate in an unserved area, right? Not the served area. So then that would not be uniform. So that's just my concern. So I just raise that for consideration.
I see. Larry.
I agree with Brian, but I still come back to the question is when we say lease terms specifically, what lease arrangements are we referring to?
I will let the committee address that.
I think it should be non-discriminatory instead of uniform. That's put in the chat as a proposed language.
I'm seeing chat now, and I'm still not seeing chat. The heck? Okay.
Looks like Chris Nurse.
Or instead of uniform is the suggestion.
That would be better from my perspective.
I would agree with that myself as well.
Who put it in the chat, by the way? Whose suggestion was it?
Chris Nurse, I think.
Okay.
Can we get an interpretation of what we mean when we say lease terms, exactly what leases we are talking about?
When I read that, I am hearing broadband infrastructure. I don't even see right of way, because oftentimes you're not leasing the right of way, you're occupying it. And that is a different.
Are we talking about private property leases? Are we talking about cell tower or water tower leases? I mean, what
Water tanks.
specifically are we talking about?
So, Larry, how would we do that here? Because by starting to delineate what leases we're talking about, we're going to obviously forget one. I mean, I believe this refers to private leases, water tank leases, leases on public property, leases on private property, leases on existing cell towers, leases on land that you're borrowing from a farmer. I mean, I would think that covers the waterfront, and I kind of think it's important that it covers the waterfront, because if you have discriminatory lease terms or other things like that, it's a barrier. And it also doesn't say what you do about it, because there's definitely, I mean, private owners can pretty much do what they want, and I think it's not always in the interest of broadband deployment that private owners can do whatever they want.
But are we saying,
so I don't think picking on a particular.
This would apply to private property owners leasing to private companies? I mean, does the same standard apply to them?
It should. If you leave it like this, it would. If you try to start delineating, then it might not. Because I don't know how you could list every single type of lease we might be talking about here. But I don't know.
Willing to say lease terms, both public and private?
I will let the private leasing companies weigh in on that. I would be fine with that personally.
Or possibly say property owners should consider the impact their lease terms may have on broadband investment.
That's too vague, my opinion. I mean, that's not, to me, that's not telling them what they should be considering when they do that. I mean, you could add that at the end. Should be non-discriminatory and sufficient to your investment, and property owners should bear this in mind when they blah blah blah. But I don't know if you take this out and put that in, then it's not really saying anything to me. I mean, it's not making a recommendation, really.
Public and private supported.
Chairwoman, if
I find too often that we have two standards. We have an expectation of what private leases should be, and then we have no expectation, or public leases should be, but no expectation of what private leases should be. And I think that it should all be the same.
I think the expectation is certainly the same. Okay,
Chairwoman,
Scott. Yes.
Yeah, Chairwoman Scott Rudd. I kind of feel like we're just repeating in a different way the bullet above. We're just saying it in a different way. I mean, could we just add lease terms to the list behind fees above, and does that capture it?
It doesn't capture the non-discriminatory point. Non-discriminatory is a specific point that is not in the thing above.
What, Chairwoman, what if we were to amend it to say fees to adopt Scott's recommendation, fees that are non-discriminatory or impede? Or, well, no, I'm sorry, because it is.
Are discriminatory.
Yeah, are discriminatory or impede.
And then we would want to add the word fees or payments, I assume.
Yep.
Of course, putting it there removes the private aspect and only means state and local.
That's true. It does do that. That's what happens. You aggregate so much that you lose the.
Private owners of property should be able to charge whatever they want if we don't think public owners of those assets should be able to do so.
But is that a regulatory? I'm sort of debating in my own mind. I'm not sure we can cover private if in reality this is regulatory barriers. Private actors are there limitations? I'm trying to figure out what we can do or what the regulators can do with respect to private property. I guess there are some aspects, right? The multi-tenant dwelling or tenant dwelling type limitations, but they're very, very different, very limited. What regulators can do or what barriers can be affected with respect to private property.
I think that's a great point, Doug.
Jonathan, Adam. Yeah, I think it's a great point too. Jonathan.
Yeah, I second that. I mean, I think we better just take this whole thing out if we're going to start getting into that messy of a world. If there's objections from the public, certainly private leases vary widely depending on arrangements that are made, between a variety of different actors. There's no way you can apply language like this across the board of all the different private arrangements that have been made. And certainly, this language is overbroad in that regard. So maybe we should just take out this whole concept, because it's hard to wordsmith that on the fly here on something this far reaching.
Well, I have two thoughts to that. One is that that there is a significant difference between private and public actors, primarily because of enforcement, which is the point that Doug raised. I think was also raised in the chat. And secondarily, I'm not entirely comfortable removing this entirely, because like I said, it's normative, and saying that private and public lease terms should be non-discriminatory and insufficient to encourage investment is basically telling everybody that they should be that way, but it's not. How it's enforced is a different question that we're not really having to address in this particular moment. Ken and Nancy.
Yeah, I share some of the concerns that have been expressed about including private transactions in this. It seems like trying to address transactions among private parties that don't include any type of public sector party just seems to be going beyond what we're otherwise addressing. So I would be fine either leaving the language as is, but substituting non-discriminatory for uniform, or trying to incorporate that concept into the prior bullet as we discussed. I do think if we incorporate it into the prior bullet, we ought to expand the list to include fees or other payments that are discriminatory, just to try to fully address the issue. But either one of those, I think, would be preferable. I think if we start going down the road of addressing actions as among purely private parties in their own freely negotiated transactions, it starts to introduce a whole other list of issues that just go beyond what I think we should be addressing.
So I actually have a question about regulation of private actors, but I think Nancy had her hand up first.
Chairwoman, go ahead and ask your question. I can wait.
My question was, so let's just take an example. If I am putting up a light pole for my Little League field, I don't have to tell anybody I'm doing it. I can just put it up, assuming that it's okay with the municipality and I've gotten it's the code and I'm meeting all of that and blah, blah, blah. But I don't have to tell the FCC I'm doing it, and I don't have to go through Section 106 compliance. But as soon as I put a radio on that light pole, I have to go through Section 106 compliance. I have to go through all of this stuff that I wouldn't have to do if it didn't have telecommunications equipment on it. So I guess my question is, there are some private actors who can be regulated by the FCC, not necessarily the farmer who's leasing you or selling you land to put a tower on, but certainly many of us are under some form of FCC regulation, so they're not purely private actors. So I guess that's just not really a question. I'm thinking that the language might be able to stand in the way it's currently written, because the FCC does have jurisdictions over some private transactions, though not all. I don't know. So that's it. That was my comment. Not really a question. I guess it was just a wool gathering comment, as it were. Nancy.
Thank you. I mean, I agree with Larry that if we're going to be talking about lease terms, we should be including public and private. And the other concern I have is, and the reason I originally suggested we narrow this to the rights of way, is to distinguish between the rights of way and other municipally owned assets that are generally treated in more of, not all of them, but some of them are treated in a proprietary capacity. And I didn't want there to be a recommendation that local governments or state governments have some sort of a duty to put their assets into, the market and put them out there and be available on non-discriminatory terms for broadband deployment. I mean, I think that's a great idea. I think in many cases, state and local governments would support that, but I don't think it's appropriate in all cases. And so if we start talking about uniform or non-discriminatory terms, access to the rights of way and access to a municipally owned, water tower or, park, those are different things. And what non-discriminatory means in those different contexts is different in my mind, because, there's more limited space on the water tower, or, there's just, it's a more complicated issue if we start thinking about proprietary activities of the local government. So I think talking about public and private leases, while I understand the point that maybe that is a little bit of a stretch under the heading minimize regulatory barriers, I do think that balances it a little bit more and perhaps avoids something of this discussion about, are we talking about proprietary assets or are we talking about the rights of way?
Okay. Jonathan.
And Nancy has a good point. I mean, the rights of way are managed in the public interest. So having a non-discriminatory requirement narrows that to public rights of way, where you would expect non-discriminatory rules makes sense. You go beyond that both for private and public property. I mean, I can speak to private. Nancy spoke to public, but when it comes to private property, I mean, you raised some points, Elizabeth, that there's certain laws that apply, but they're extremely narrowly targeted. I mean, you have 106, and NEPA might be a federal undertaking to put an antenna on, which we could debate that. I won't do that here, but the idea that terms and conditions of a contract between private parties is what we want to deal with here. Those are, in terms of non-discriminatory, governed by antitrust laws, which is way outside of our scope. I mean, if there's some type of discrimination that would be anti-competitive, then that would be under a totally different set of laws than what we're dealing with here. And I think it would actually impede broadband deployment to start requiring certain straitjackets on private transactions and contracts that are across such a broad array of areas that we don't want to kind of, as I said earlier, draft this on the fly while we're speaking. But if we want to do it more narrowly targeted toward, rights of way, public rights of way, that might be a good way to cut it.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Larry Hanson.
Is this the edit that's being proposed, just to be clear?
Well, saying lease terms for public rights of way should be non-discriminatory and sufficient. That's what Jonathan said, Nancy said. I could support that. Lease terms for public rights of way.
So what about publicly owned property that are not in the rights of way? Those could be discriminatory?
No, but those are transactional. I mean, those are negotiated. I mean, there's so many factors that come into a school or a water tower or a public building that they're just not as simple as use of a public owned right of way. I mean,
Well, I do agree with that. But I also think that if a city has room on their water tank for, and I'm really just asking the question, for 3 providers, and they've got one on there, and they're like, well, since you're the second one, I'm going to charge you double.
Chairwoman, I think this begins to defeat the spirit. I mean, if we're going to get this precision in our shot on this, it's a recommendation. I think we maybe, I think we're losing. We're getting very empirical on one, and we're losing the spirit of the recommendation, which is, again, we're not seeking to remove or minimize regulatory barriers for rights of ways, right? We're seeking in the aggregate to identify opportunities that minimize regulatory barriers in a pretty broad sense. And I just feel like I think we're losing the spirit here. We're certainly going to, I think, tender a very specific recommendation here if that's the exercise. But I'll tell you, and I don't want to, I'll yield here for Claude and Jeff, who chaired this group, but the intention here was to, paint a pretty broad stroke for the examination. That we're not prescribing regulation right now. We're offering recommendations for the study of these things. I feel like we're getting down into the net of prescribing, statute, and I don't think that's the intention of this group. With all respect.
I hear you, Claude or Jeff. Do either of you want to weigh in? So
I would also be interested in hearing Jeff's thoughts on this, but yes, this I think Tom is 100% correct. We were, as a group, we were trying to come up with a number of things, both high level and to some extent, specific when it made sense, to advance the goal of deploying broadband in low income communities, where we weren't seeking to relitigate what previous BDAC reports had done. And the goal here was to provide a set of high level recommendations that would spur further conversation and on well, hey, maybe that's a good idea. Maybe we should take a look at that further. And the intention absolutely was not to provide legislative text. We tried to hew to some other reports had been done. This is not a model code. This is a report, and I think that bears remembering.
So what do you want to do with that lease terms? You want it to go back as originally written? Do you want to accept the change from uniform to non-discriminatory? Because any changes that are made at this point, you can accept, and you can have the BDAC vote on it the way you had it, or you can accept the changes or not accept the changes, because what you're saying is how I view it. But
yeah, I would like to, if Jeff is still on, I would like to hear his views as well, since he was deeply engaged on this with the drafting team.
Hi, this is Jeff. And thanks, Claude and Tom and Elizabeth all. I agree with Tom and Claude. I think this is a general statement of principles and lessons learned. And the more we try to carve out exceptions, or the more detail we add to it, the less value these recommendations have. The fact that it makes some parties uncomfortable is good in my mind. We have a lot of provisions and statements and comments that we uncomfortably adopted because we're trying to appeal to a broader sense of what it takes to deploy broadband in low-income areas. So I think, as Tom pointed out, the spirit of this report includes some issues that not everybody completely agrees with, and we're trying not to be prescriptive. This is a list of recommendations from which people may or may not adopt actual policies to implement. So I think Tom and Claude and others have correctly expressed the spirit of the report, and the more detailed we get in there, statutory, we're not writing a code or a statute. That kind of detail, I think, waters down the utility of the report, and I'd like to keep it as much to what we've proposed and what has been vetted now extensively, and so I think deviating too far from that intent does not serve the report well. That said, I'm fine with switching out uniform and putting in non-discriminatory. I would have opposed eliminating the bullet above, but I think the compromise solution is fine. I'm just getting a little sensitive that we're over wordsmithing here, and in that effort, we are diluting the utility and value of the report.
So Jeff, just to clarify, we have voted to remove this bullet, and what we're discussing now is
understood.
Yeah,
I'm not going to go back over that. So we're on this bullet, and I think lease terms, by the way, to answer the question, lease terms was raised, I think, not in the context of right of way. So There are many readers of this provision that will interpret lease terms to be non-discriminatory and should be sufficient to encourage broadband investment in their own way. And I think, quite frankly, that's good. I don't want to limit what readers consider when they see this. This is intentionally broad.
So if I hear you correctly, the change from uniform to non-discriminatory is acceptable, but you want to remove the words for public rights of way, both public and private, which of course would not be what the edit would be anyway.
Yes, Madam Chair, that's correct.
Okay. All right. Then we move on. I think we're up to Maurita. Right? Yes, we are up to Maurita.
So Maria may have had to drop. She had a question about the scope of the work that the BDAC was working on specifically for the low-income working group. And she was curious whether or not she noticed there was no reference to Lifeline in this report. And we clarified in the chat that as part of the charges, the FCC had specifically asked this working group not to focus on any potential changes to the Universal Service Fund, as those issues would be the province of the joint board. And so she clarified she had just joined as Rick and Thacker's replacement for NMTC. So that's why she wasn't aware of that originally.
Okay, perfect. Yes, that makes sense. Okay. So we have Nancy and then Scott.
I apologize, Madam Chair. I just wanted to, I don't know that we finished the discussion. We started talking about removing the list of bills. And then I made the comment about the footnote on facilitate wireless tower siting, the footnote to the thing. And just real quickly, just in response to the comment about it being general, that concerns me because the FCC can list, or other governmental agencies can lift these terms down the road and say, hey, the BDAC recommended that lease terms should be non-discriminatory, and apply that in context that we weren't anticipating. And that's why the broad scope of some of these recommendations is concerning to me, because I don't want to have voted in favor of something that somebody else reads in a completely different way than I did and is used in a way that I never anticipated. So that, you know, I am very concerned about going on record voting for things that could be taken in a variety of ways. So I just wanted to make that point. Thank you all again for spending so much time on these concerns. If we have a moment to talk about those last two issues, that's great. But I understand it's time to move on.
No, yeah, we need to tie those up. So yes. So as far as the draft legislation, that is up to the committee. I think the comment has been made that may be backwards, that we're referencing the BDAC to the draft legislation, which may actually reference the BDAC, which would make it circular. So I guess the question for the committee is, how do you feel about removing those?
Where do we see that, Elizabeth?
It was it's right where you are. Senator Corwin's Eliminate the Digital Divide Act, 10.1.
Oh,
that last bullet on that. Yeah, the recommendation is to delete these because they are not actually, they're just proposed.
There's a comment in the draft that I actually thought was that might inform us, and I'm trying to look for who said it, but basically these bill numbers expire at the end of the year. So it might be problematic if somebody's using these citation links, but
well, what happens if you change it to say several legislative proposals in the U.S. House and Senate have been,
or even tie it to the 116th Congress? Again, these are
something
just,
like that.
Yeah, these are just, you know, flags to get there. But
yeah. Well, I can say I've often used, like in Arkansas, I've often used, 32 broadband acts have come and been killed in the Arkansas legislature is like one of my talking points. So the fact that this legislation is coming up and not necessarily gaining traction, I think is of note. I don't know what these particular provisions state in detail.
I actually like putting them in there. I mean, from my argument, it does lend that we've been tackling this a lot of different ways, right?
Yep.
So
I agree with David. It's not saying these are things we think people need to focus on and consider. It's just that here's information. I still think it's sort of instructive.
Okay.
And I remember when we were looking at these, they were pretty good examples across the board. So.
So do we want to leave them or delete them? We have a comment in the chat that Commissioner Peterson is fine with deleting them, but I don't have an opinion. And we have are these comments to this, we have Scott and Doug and Eve, I think in that order.
I'll pass on this item.
Okay, Doug.
Yeah, the only thing I wanted to go back to is Nancy's, not on this issue, but Nancy's earlier comment about having, whether it's the commission or others taking this information out of context. I'm not sure we can control that or can be or should be concerned about it. I mean, this report is comprehensive and detailed. If somebody reads it from top to bottom, I think, what we're spending all this time on now is like making sure it conveys what we want it to convey as a group. And I don't think we can or should be worried about what someone might do with it in the future. Otherwise, well, why say anything? So I don't know that I understood Nancy's comment on that point, but that was, I just want to respond to that.
Thank you. Eve.
Thank you, Chairwoman. So I have just one response to the listing of the bills, and then I have one other comment. So I may hold off on my other comment till after we're done with those items. But as it relates to the bills, I mean, personally, I just don't think that the role of the BDAC here is to endorse very nuanced legislation. And I could see where, there are some general concepts and some good ideas in each one of those bills that you could synthesize out and maybe just make reference to the idea itself. But to basically rubber stamp the bills in total, I do have some concerns, because when I did pull them up and reviewed them in depth, I could go into my concerns with each one of the bills, but I don't think I need to here. But I just don't think it's appropriate in this context. I appreciate the examples as given, but I think it illustrates my point that being so specific actually has a downside, because then that means that all of the ideas contained in those pieces of legislation are being rubber stamped. And I don't know that that's really where we want to go with this. And so I would vote to remove those citations.
Yeah, and that picks up, sorry to interrupt, but Eve, that's interesting. I did not view this as being endorsed at all. So maybe I'm just misunderstanding, or maybe that's what the problem is. And David, please weigh in it from your perspective as well. But I didn't view what was being done by the addition of these as an endorsement in any way, simply as offering information for people to consider. Maybe we can play with it sorry.
That was the intent. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Yep.
So the intent is
I
just
only
to
get
say
see the document. That's all that comes up on my laptop, so I can't see everybody's faces.
So the intent was, David, to what?
It was just to provide examples. I mean, and we went through, and Tom and Claude and Jeff, I mean, please weigh in. I mean, the idea was to provide some good, what we thought had some legislation that had good examples, but we were not endorsing any particular legislation here.
Yeah, that's definitely, that was the intention, was just to.
Yeah, sorry.
No, nothing more to add than what David just said. But again,
maybe we need to add
it's not a hill
that listing of these is not an endorsement.
Yeah, that's right. Or again, I don't think this is a hill we die on. To me, this is us trying to be helpful. If we want to task the reader with going and finding this on their own, we can be silent on it. Again, I think our intention was to spur dialogue and to facilitate, not exemplars in the case of not to be that to be construed with endorsement, but just to say, you can go hunt these. These are things that should encapsulate a lot of debate, pro and con for it. So, and we were very, and let me say this, very intentional in trying to be bipartisan in the representation of these bills.
Right.
So you're not going to find an ideological bent on it either.
Chris Nurse.
Yeah, and I think that.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I think that's a very good edit there about the but not endorsement. I certainly didn't support every one of the aspects of every one of those bills, but I didn't take it for that. I think it's improved with the clarifying edit. I just took it to for sort of the point. This is an indicia of the societal interest in this issue and area, that you have so many bills, and on both sides, that this is an area of active social change, and this is the time to engage on this, and I think that's pretty non-controversial.
Okay, so that leaves the footnote that Nancy raised. Where's that footnote, Nancy?
.12. Here.
I think page 25, I believe, at the very first bullet point in 2.5.1.12.
I love all the numbers.
Madam Chair, in the interest, to the extent that I have any sway on that, we're fine with the removal of that. If I may be so bold to speak on behalf of our committee.
Well, you're the chair of the committee, so.
Yeah,
All
so
right.
with the executive privilege, I'll strike that for purposes of moving forward.
I'm going to make this edit and
All right.
see if it actually works, if it messes everything up. Let's see.
Are you
That-
breaking the
okay.
formatting?
Yep.
Do you need to take out, it fixed okay.
Yep,
Fix
you
the
got it.
numbers. All right. Okay, that is, Eve, is your hand? Your other comment. Yes, Eve.
Sorry about that. And I don't mean
No,
to
you're good.
wind us back. There was just one other aspect that is near and dear to my heart, and I just wanted to raise this, that one of the bullet points right under the lease terms bullet point, but the expedite and simplify environmental reviews. So I would feel comfortable with the word expedite so long as all of the normal NEPA and the regulatory processes are still adhered to. I think in the letter from that's cited here from USDA Memorandum Understanding, June 12th, they talked about setting times and page limits on the completion of environmental documents, categorical exclusions. I mean, I just don't see a rational basis to exclude this industry or the reviews on the environmental impacts to be supported by just this one effort. So expedite for sure. If the same processes are going to be in place and there's just quicker timelines for them, absolutely. But to simplify, I think that's the word I'm getting hung up on. And perhaps, the USDA Memorandum of Understanding, I don't know that I really think that stands true for the sentence now if you remove the word simplify. So if we could couch the USDA memorandum in some way and remove the simplify, then I'm totally in support of expediting the environmental reviews, just ensuring that they are still completed.
So just a question is, when you say environmental reviews, you're not including SHPO in that, right? That's just what the USDA environmental, does that include section 106, or is this provision really just talking about, geotech, and does this include archaeological and historic? I'm not really sure what all's involved in this. And I ask because I'm going through a rather intensive environmental review for some CARES Act projects we're working on. And I haven't noticed that it's particularly complex. I've just noticed that it takes a long time. So I'm completely in line with your edit, but what's taking the longest is not just making sure that I'm not the wetlands issue. That's not what's taking forever, is determining whether it's a wetlands. What's taking forever is the archaeological historic tribe review, the section 106 review. And I don't know if this is, if that could take out the word simplify and maybe expand it to include other types of reviews. Those can take up to 90 days or more.
I guess my question back would be, is it the governmental entity that's reviewing that's taking the amount of time, or is it the professionals producing those reports that are taking the time?
It is generally not SHPO. and it is the geotext takes forever. I mean, that takes weeks, and so that's the professionals producing the reports. But and the other providers should correct me because this is just my personal experience in this one project. But a lot of it, when you have to have when you have to have oversight, when you have to have somebody monitoring the site because of archaeological concerns, that is appropriate and often speeds things up because you're not having to go through a full environmental review before you can start work. But a lot of times you have to go through a full environmental review before and that just extends the timeline. It's part of why telecom projects take a long time, but not the only reason by far. Chris, do you have your hand up? I'm sorry, Chris.
I just wanted to kind of be clear, if you will. There's sort of good simplify and bad simplify. And by bad simplify, I agree that you can't not follow the legal parameters and NEPA and the rest of that. But within the scope of the regulations have procedures for, say, categorical exclusions, and if you properly follow those, there was an instance where maybe they didn't properly follow those, but if you properly follow that, a categorical exclusion can be quite reasonable and quite impactful. But I think that we should be supportive of streamlining, say, within the parameters of the governing environmental, historical and any other statutory regimes.
So what would that edit look like, Chris?
I mean, I think it's, expedite and, streamline, sort of, comma, within the parameters of the statutory, the controlling statutory regime.
I think expedite and streamline are the same thing, are they not?
No, expedite is do the procedure faster. Streamline is change the procedure, right? So if you're having to do a review for every one, then you want to do that under your time, your timelines, your shot clocks, if you will. If you get a category, if they go through and they categorically exclude small cells under 3 cubic feet or something like that, then you don't have to do the review, and now you're shooting through that process because it's been done categorically rather than done on an individual case by case.
So is this edit what you're proposing, Chris? Expedite and streamline within the existing regulatory requirements?
Right.
And strike simply. Eve?
Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just trying to make sure that.
Yes.
Okay.
Right. I appreciate the addition of existing regulatory requirements. I think that really solidifies, I think what Chris was saying, the good streamlining or the good simplifying versus the bad simplifying. So I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Okay. 1 second, sorry. So let's see where we're okay. Expedite and streamline within the existing regulatory requirements of environment reviews of broadband initiatives. Okay. All right. Do we have other comments or thoughts to any of this? Let's see. Still not seeing chat, so let me check this image from Justin.
I've been trying to keep up on that.
No, yeah, Justin's been also texting to me. A motion to the lease is to say, okay. So going back, this is from Larry, going back to the lease term issue, Larry would like to make the change to read lease terms for public rights of way should be non-discriminatory.
And sufficient to encourage investment. Yep. What's written here on the board?
Madam Chair, if that's a motion, I will second that motion.
Okay, well, we can vote that. Give me 1 second. All right, so we have a motion and a second. I will call for a vote on whether we want to limit the lease term provision to public rights of way. So if everyone will vote in the chat. All right, that passes. All right, so that change has passed. I'm going to open it up for any further comments, other changes to this. Nancy.
Just a quick question, is there was a change made in that identify state and local statutes bullet to add our discriminatory or. I think we'd already voted on that section. I might be misremembering now before that language was added. So it's just not clear to me if that is staying or going or if that requires a vote.
We did, but it was added just to track whether we were going to delete this lower bullet. So I think we've accomplished that down here.
Great, thank you.
No, thank you. Tracking all of the proposals. Trying to make sure we get a vote on everything, okay?
Okay.
Do we need to vote on this?
Keeping bullets? We do not. You actually don't need to vote change by change.
Okay.
It's not strictly necessary, but those two were important enough that it was fine to do a separate vote. But the other stuff, we don't really need to do that, although we can, but it will go, unless somebody feels strongly about it, I think we'll just vote at the end. Is there anyone else who has any other comments? I am not seeing any hands. I would like to call for a motion to approve the report of, and I'm going to get the name correctly. I would like to ask for a motion to approve the report of the Increasing Broadband Investment in Low-Income Communities Working Group.
Elizabeth, I'll second that.
Thank you. I will call it to the vote. Please vote in the chat.
Couple more votes rolling in, but looks like a unanimous vote.
All right. Well, congratulations, Tom, Claude, Jeff, and everyone else on work well done. And for your unanimous vote out on your report. I know that was yeoman's work. It was a lot of effort, and really appreciate the level of effort that you put in, and it shows with your unanimous approval of the report. So with that, I would like to, oh wait, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm trying to see where we are in the agenda. Oh, I think we may be done. Okay. So I want to appreciate everybody for contributing to the discussion. I think it's very important to have these conversations. And I want to say, just personally, Nancy, I don't think you should rally for bringing every concern you have. That's why we're here. And so thank you for your comments, and thank you for everybody for participating in an excellent and spirited discussion. So with that, I'm going to open the floor for general discussion. Does anyone have anything to bring before the committee? Oh, Jonathan has his hand up.
I did. I just thought maybe we could all reflect for a minute. Now that we're done, if people need to go, they can. But I just can't help thinking back, you know, as we think about Old Lang Syne coming up and the year wrapping up, even if Congress is still going strong, you know, all the work that we've done on this group, it's amazing. You know, I'd like to thank you, Chairman Bowles, for all the leadership. I'm thinking way back to the beginning. An amazing run of accomplishment from the many chairs. You know, today, of course, we got the low-income group done, and that's going to be something that's going to be very important going forward. I think that this BDAC has had an enormous impact on policy and deployment around the country, as the chairman intended. And we've set the table for an enormous amount of further progress in the next administration. So I first need to really, I think, this might be our last meeting as possible. And I want to thank Chairman Pai for establishing this group and think about all that we've done, not only today, but, you know, the working group on workforce issues is a good example of how we're going to have an impact going forward. I think that that's already being used in discussions with the transition about what some of the issues are facing the country. You know, the disaster response recovery group that Red couldn't join us today, but he chaired so ably, and I was able to vice chair, set us up not only for, you know, continuing work on the pandemic, but going forward in the future, what could be more important than that? And, you know, I go back to when I was chair of the Fed Lands Working Group, and that's something that is also already implemented a lot of change in how the federal government, how this administration has dealt with federal lands. I think there's plenty left in that report to be done in the next administration. But, you know, think of all that we did on the model code for municipalities that Doug headed, or the model code for states that Kelly McGriff headed. You know, the competitive access to broadband infrastructure that Ken Simon headed led to specific changes in FCC rules that are improving deployment today. Bob DeBrew headed the removing state and local barriers. I mean, there's been a heck of a lot of work done, Madam Chair, under your leadership and under this BDAC. And, you know, I just think it was worth reflecting for a minute on how much of a change we've made, how much of the work we've done has been unanimous as it was today. And the work in both of the groups that I chaired or vice chaired were unanimous as well. There's been some debates and there's been some heated resignations and various things, but all said and done, we pretty much got it done in a cooperative spirit. And I just think we can all be proud of the work that we've done. I want to thank you. I want to thank the chairman and the commission for the opportunity to serve on this group in case we don't get the chance to meet again.
Thank you. Michael Hain.
There, I got the mute button. Jonathan, fantastic. I would like to echo your comments. One of the greatest things that the commission did in bringing this diverse group together was that we gained some friendships. We gained some insight into different perspectives. It allowed us to not just, I don't want to say demonize the opposition, but it brought us together so that we were on a common task. There was no opposition. Well, COVID, I guess, is opposition. But the big thing is that I really appreciate the skills, the talents, the commitment of everybody across the industry, and the things that we've been able to do together, as you said, Jonathan, they've been stellar. I think we've really done a lot to get ready for COVID. I mean, had we not had the committee, had we not had the CAF auctions, had we not done those things, we wouldn't have been in as good of a position as we were. Anyway, just congratulations, and Chairman Bowles, you've done a fantastic job. Every time I hear your mouth open, there's some tremendous piece of wisdom that comes out, and that goes for everybody here. And Chris, I really appreciate your perspective on things. I mean, I had no idea what kind of challenges that your company had to go through to deploy broadband, but that's what we're all about here, you know. And David, I'd sure like to shake your hand again. I mean, that big meaty handshake, that's an awesome thing. But Justin, you've done a great job as well. I really appreciate that. And that beard's coming in pretty good. I mean, all right, well, that's it. I think this may be our last call, and I do appreciate the privilege, the opportunity to be here. I would further like to say that I appreciate Chairman Pai, his leadership role, his hands-off approach on it. But the idea that he's done what he thought was right, especially when it was not popular. And I think that's helped to move us all forward. And again, it's been my privilege to be part of this, and I thank everybody very much. I'm going to mute before I tear up.
Thank you, Chris. Christners.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Yeah, I just, you know, I didn't volunteer. I was drafted, but it's been a really great experience for me, both, you know, personally and professionally. I think, Michael, thank you for your comments, but you know, you sort of mentioned the, you know, demonization, which there's kind of a lot of in society today, and I think it really did help a lot demonize you know, people's perspective about, you know, the other side, if you will. You know, opponents are not necessarily enemies. You know, and you know, certainly, you know, Nancy and David and, you know, Larry and Eve, you know, at the you know, the municipal side, it really did provide a forum for us to, you know, reach out and connect and to find some common ground, and we did find a lot of common ground, and I almost kind of wish this had happened, you know, some years sooner. All of our lives might have been a little smoother. So it's been, I mean, it is a tedious, time-intensive process, but it does work, and it also gives us control over the outcome. You know, a lot of these other processes are kind of jump balls, you know, and you don't really know how it's going to come out. And you know, by working together, we're able to shape a consensus outcome, and you know, that's a good process. And enjoyed working with you all on it, and it's really been helpful to me. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. I am close to making my closing statement, but before then, I would like to ask Justin if he would like to say something.
Sure, thank you, Chair. So real quick, I know we've heard from the chairman, thanking you for all of your hard work. We just heard from the bureau chief, thanking you for all your hard work. So I can't offer much on top of those two, but I do want to say thank you for all your hard work and your flexibility in turning what was an in-person federal advisory committee into a electronic federal advisory committee, and the amount of work that takes for, you know, rescheduling meetings and negotiating edits to items on the fly remotely, and raising your hand and really working together collegially. That's been a fantastic effort for all of you. And so thank you for the great work you've done. This is a great example of why federal advisory committees can exist and add a lot of value. We bring together a number of people from diverse backgrounds who really can help inform each other, the commission, the public, and it does do a great service to both all of us, industry, as well as just the public who have a chance to learn from all of your wisdom. So thank you very much. I know that Chairman will be talking after me real quick, but I do want to say, you know, the charter for the BDAC does continue on until March 2021. We'll see what happens after the administration changes. So, you know, we'll definitely be in touch. We may not have another meeting, but if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me, and I'll be talking to you all at least before March, if not earlier. So thank you and happy holidays, everyone.
So, yes, I was going to say that I also feel like this might be our last meeting under the circumstances, and certainly our charter has been completed, but we are still on deck until March of 2021. So we may yet be asked to answer the call again, in which case I know we all will. I want to personally express how amazing this experience has been for me, and how much I've enjoyed both being on the BDAC and chairing it, and how much I've enjoyed working with all of you in various different contexts, and the reports. I think we've done amazing work that we can all be very, very proud of, and I am personally honored to have been a part of it. So I see David put up his hand, so I'll let you say something before we adjourn.
Again, really echoing your comments. Over the last couple of years that I've had the pleasure to work here, I've met some really great people, including you, Chris Nurse. Just kidding. But it's been a pleasure and eye-opening experience from my side as well. So thank you all, and I hope you have a great holiday.
So with that, and with my eternals, and with the warning that you may yet have more to do, I'm going to thank you all again and wish you all happy holidays and a wonderful new year. And we will hopefully see each other again soon. With that, we are adjourned.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.